music, dance, theater. It's time to take a seat on the aisle with Tom Alvarez. Hear from performers, producers, presenters, and creators who enrich our lives in the performing arts. Who's on stage? Here is Tom Alvarez to introduce you.
Hello, and welcome to On the Aisle with me, Tom Alvarez. Today, my guest is well-known arts patron Frank Basile, a retired senior vice president of the Gene B. Glick Company, where he worked for 33 years. In addition to his business career, Basile has made a name for himself as a prominent public speaker, author, and community volunteer. Basile and his wife Katrina help support many arts organizations across central Indiana, including the Indianapolis Arts Center, the Phoenix Theater, Storytelling Arts of Indiana, the Indiana Historical Society, Fonseca Theater, and the Center for the Performing Arts in Carmel. Join me now as I go on the aisle for a conversation with this community treasure. Well, hello, Frank. I'm just so delighted that you agreed to be on my show.
Hi, Tom. Well, I'm delighted to be on your show.
Well, so let's talk about our history because we've known each other a long time. And I wanted to remind you, I don't know if you remember when we met, but of course, okay, I was at a gallery downtown. It was on the ground floor of the Conrad. And I don't know if that gallery is still there. Do you? The art gallery?
No, I don't, but I do remember that.
Okay, so you were in attendance, and I knew who you were. We had not met. Of course, who doesn't know Frank Basile, especially if you're anywhere near the performing art or the arts in general, of course. So I knew you, your reputation had preceded you. So when I saw you, I thought, oh my goodness, here's my chance to finally, reach out, introduce myself and get to know Frank. Of course, I was fully aware of you through our mutual friendship with the late Brian Fonseca. And I knew that you had supported the Festival of New Playwrights, FEAT, I believe it was called, right?
Yes.
And so you had been a major supporter of the Phoenix and Brian. And so that's why I knew you to be not only an important patron, but also from all accounts from Brian and just your reputation, that you were someone that I wanted to finally get to know. I had a great respect for you. So I reached out to you. I went up and I introduced myself to you. Do you remember that?
Yes, I do.
And I told you a little bit about myself and said, and I think we talked about Brian and his work. And then from that point on, we've remained friends. And of course, you've also been a supporter of Dustin Klein and me and our company.
Yes.
Klein and Alvarez Productions, Magic Thread Cabaret, and then before that, Call to the Musical. And so for our listeners, I just kind of want to qualify that, that we've had a long association, and it's been one of the gifts of my life.
And the same with me, Tom. I've enjoyed our relationship.
And we've had so many discussions about so many things, notwithstanding, our love of the arts. And we also discovered that we have a lot in common in terms of our background. And so I want to spend a little time, talking about Frank Basile, the person. Of course, I've done several interviews with you, and all folks have to do is go to my website, On the Aisle with Tom Alvarez, and you can, just put your name in there and find these interviews that we did. And so I think that, we pretty much covered a lot of territory, but for people who didn't read those or won't read them, so let's start with your background, okay? Give me a thumbnail sketch of where you came from and a little bit about your growing up, okay?
Okay. Well, I was born in New Orleans, and my family was a good, loving family but we didn't have much money. And the family worked quite a bit, including the 6 kids. I was one of 6. And
where did you come in the lineup? Where were you in the lineup?
I'm the oldest.
Okay.
Yep. And we really were not exposed to the arts in those days, not only because my parents couldn't afford to send us to any arts events. Frankly, they were not even on their radar. I don't think they were really aware of the arts at all. And so the first opportunity that I had to learn anything about the arts was when I was in college. And one day I saw a notice that there was a free play being produced by the drama department. So I didn't know much about a play. So I went to that. And I have to tell you, Tom, it was love at first sight. I loved watching that play. In fact, I went to see it again, because it was free.
What was the name of it?
You know, it's a good question. I can't remember it. It was like 70 years ago. And I don't remember what it was, but it made a difference. It really began to let me know that the arts are so important to the quality of life. And I remember thinking at that time, I hope that there are other kids who are not able to attend or to enjoy arts events at an early age. And if I ever was in a position to prevent that from happening, I would try to do so. And that really became part of my mission, to help to ensure that kids at a young age are exposed to the arts. In fact, even in school in those days, it wasn't even part of our curriculum, the arts. So the first I had was when I was in my 20s to learn the arts.
Tell me about your education. Where did you go to school?
Went to a relatively new high school at the time. It was run by the Christian Brothers, and it was called De La Salle. And so I attended that for 4 years, and I got to the school by walking 7 or 8 blocks to the streetcar line on St. Charles Avenue, and I took a streetcar to the high school. And then after I graduated from the high school, I went to Tulane, which was further down St. Charles Avenue, so I could continue to take the streetcar to go to Tulane. And that's where my first exposure to the arts, was at Tulane.
Okay, so you went to a high school. Were you taught by Christian brothers, all brothers, and not nuns, right?
That's correct.
Okay.
And I have to and it's interesting thing that occurred then, Tom, is that one of the brothers in the class, I was in the Spanish class, and in those days, each student would read an excerpt from the book. And when it came my turn to read, I would choke up, and I would sweat. My hands would shake. And Brother Amity, after one of the classes, said, "Frank, you can't go through life like that, being so afraid to speak." And I said, "What do you suggest I do?" And I was fully expecting that he would say I should take a speech class. And I said, "A speech class?" And he said, "No." He said, "You're too far gone for that. It'll take doing something that you actually fear in order to overcome it." And I said, "Like what?" He said, "We have a debating team here." And I said, "No, I can't do that." And he persuaded me to do it. And Tom, it changed my life. And I remember the first speech that I gave, I had to leave the podium because I got sick. But he forced me to persevere, along with 3 other relatively new speakers on the debate team at the time. And we ended up, after the second year, winning the Louisiana State Debating Championship. And that really, as I said, changed my life, because it gave me the confidence and the ability to communicate, which is so important in everything that we do.
I would say that that laid a great foundation, because, to this day, you continue to be a sought-after motivational speaker. But we'll get into that later. In the meantime, though, so the Christian Brothers, I would presume that they had very high academic standards. So you got a really good, speaking foundations, a great educational foundation, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And was it heavy on liberal arts?
Not really.
Okay.
It was more, it was college preparatory and a lot of math.
I see.
Yeah, and science and so on.
So
And it
then,
was, and I elected courses when I went to college to give me more liberal arts.
so how is it that you chose Tulane? Because it was near home and because of
Yes.
finances and all right?
Yep, because it was near home and because I got a scholarship, and
Mm-hmm.
then I borrowed the rest of it.
Uh-huh.
And so that's how I financed it.
So how was it growing up in New Orleans? And by the way, what happened to your New Orleans accent? I hear a little tinge of it once in a while.
But, Tom, whenever I talk about um, New Orleans and I get to my address and I get to my zip code, which is 46240, someone
Mhm.
will say, "Are you from New York or Brooklyn?" Because actually, New Orleans people, as you may know, have that kind of a Brooklyn brogue. They sound like they're from New Orleans, the people who are truly New Orleanians.
That's interesting. I didn't know that. But I digress, but I heard recently that, people who lose their Southern accent, once they're back home, though, it comes back to them
Yes,
naturally. Does that happen to you
that
when you're down
happens.
in New
Yes,
Orleans?
yes. And in fact,
Yeah.
I found it a few weeks ago whenever we
Mhm.
had a little reunion of myself and my five sisters in Houston, and it
Mhm.
all came back. And if you can imagine,
So were
six
you
Italians.
were so you were all yawling all the time.
Yes, right.
Y'all.
Yep.
That's great. So would you say that you were is there such a thing as a New Orleans sensibility that you still have? Is there such a thing?
I don't know.
Or a
I would not recognize it if it was.
Southern sensibility? I mean, there are a lot of cultural features that from the people in the South have over, say, I'm generalizing here, but you know what I mean.
Yes.
Are you still a Southern boy by heart? I guess what
I'll
I'm
have to say, Tom, I'll have to say, yes, I am.
Yeah, and what makes that? Well, I know you're a gentleman, so that's part of it. You were raised, right,
Right.
to be polite, correct?
Yes. And I think that's part of it. I think being polite and being kind. Now, but that's not to say that people from other parts aren't the
Oh,
same
of
way. So I
course,
never want to say that.
of
But
course.
my experience has been that people from the South uh, are, in general, kind people and caring about one another. And I know we did in our family, despite the fact of not having much money and, not participating in various events and so on.
Well, of course, part of your story has to do with your great success working for Gene Glick, that company. And yet it sounds like, your humble beginnings. Would you call yourself a self-made man?
Probably with a lot of help along the way, as most of us have. I've had what I'd call mentors that have helped, beginning with that brother Amity that I mentioned, who forced me to join the
Mhm.
debating team, and which was a turning point in my life. So I had a lot of help along the way,
Are you,
including
Go ahead.
including you had mentioned the Glick company, including Gene Glick.
Mhm. Well, that itself is, that whole part of your life is fascinating, what you accomplished there. But before you got there, so what happened after college?
Well, after college, because part of how I was able to afford to go to Tulane was because of a Continental Oil Company, a Conoco scholarship. So I kind of felt an obligation to go to work for them and did not thoroughly interview to find out what other possibilities there were in a career field. So I moved to Houston, worked for Conoco, doing something I should not have been doing. I was a budget analyst, that was not what I should be doing. And I was doing it for 2 years. And one day I got bypassed for a promotion that I knew I should have gotten. So I went to my boss and I said, how come I didn't get this? And he said, you do a really good job and you're the best person in the department, but Marvin needs the money. He's married and so on. And right then I thought to myself, I don't belong here. This is my opportunity to make a change. But had it not been for that, I probably would have hung on and continued working there. But that forced me to rediscover and to rethink what I was doing. So at that point, I did what I should have done when I graduated, and that is I reviewed potential job opportunities, and that's when I discovered the Ford Motor Company.
Okay.
And that was my first great opportunity.
So Frank, what was your degree from Tulane, by the way? What was your major?
Business.
Okay.
Because I didn't know what I wanted to do, and I figured that would help me in whatever I decided.
Well, I remember, and I want to go back to your college days, because you told me a story in an interview, which I want you to repeat here, because it says a lot about you and business and your acumen. So talk about the watermelon truck.
Well, in high school, one day the principal came up to me and he said, Frank, we haven't received your tuition for this semester. And I said, oh, I thought it was paid. And he said, I haven't received it. So when I went home that evening, I asked my mother, and she said, well, I gave the money in cash, as they did, and I gave it to your dad. And on the way, he gambled it. He really felt like he could multiply that amount and so on. So we don't have it. And there was no way that I felt I could go to school and tell the principal that I could not pay for my tuition. So we had an old truck. And I was old enough to drive. I didn't quite have my license, but I took that old truck down to the French market, which is the farmer's market. And I located a farmer who had a load of watermelons and wanted to go home. And so I said, you know what? I'd like to buy your load of watermelons if I can pay you tomorrow, if you'll be back here. And he thought about it for a moment. He knew my dad and so on. He said, okay, I'll do it. So I took that load of watermelons to a parish, which is what they call their counties in Louisiana, a parish right outside of New Orleans, parked the truck, put a sign out, 3 watermelons for $1, and sold the whole load of watermelons. And I went back to the market because I didn't have enough money yet. And I found a farmer who had a load of peaches. And I made the same deal with him. And I bought the peaches. We loaded it onto my truck. I went to the same place. We sold all of the peaches, and I made enough to pay for the tuition. And I felt so good. And it really began kind of my entrepreneurial bent. And again, like so many things happen when a misfortune occurs, such as when I was bypassed for a promotion at Conoco, it encouraged me to do what I should have done before, and that is to look for an appropriate job. The same way here, I had that setback, so it enabled me to do something that helped me to grow as a person.
And reading between the lines, your mention of your father having gambling issues. So it sounds like, you had some struggles in your personal life too, your family life, that also informed everything else, correct?
That is correct.
Yeah.
And in fact, at our little reunion, I told my sisters, we were talking about our spouses and everything, and I said, Katrina is from one of the only non-dysfunctional families I know. And immediately, my sisters jumped on me and said, are you saying our family was dysfunctional? And of course, there was nothing I could say at that point, but oh, yeah. But again, most families, I think, in my experience, have been.
Mine too, Frank, and we've talked about some of the things we have in common. I come from a large Catholic family, and I came up blue collar, so we have that in common. But in terms of that reunion, let's talk about that reunion because I mean you referenced it, but I want the listeners to know what happened, and it was recently. I mean,
Yes.
not what happened literally. I mean the idea you hadn't seen your whole family for a while. Talk about your family right now.
I know we're all between 75 and 85, and it said I'm the oldest. And I don't know how much longer we're all going to be around. And that's why I encouraged them, all of us, to get together for that reunion so we could get, and it was really intense. There was nothing we wanted to see in Houston. We'd already been there many times. So we spent 3 or 4 days at one of the houses and talked and gave our version of what happened when we were growing up, which was not always the same, but it was very informative. And we hugged one another and all, even though we had some disagreements and everything. It was a loving time, which I will always remember.
How long had it been since you'd seen the whole group together, or been
About
with
6 or 7 years in New Orleans.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you mentioned Katrina. Well, we couldn't have this interview if we didn't mention your beloved Katrina Basile. I mean, your names are together on some of the most iconic arts buildings in town. So she's very much a part of your story. Tell me about Katrina.
Well, Katrina was was the daughter. They had two. She had a sister. The two of them were daughters of a Pentecostal minister. So that was kind of her background. And when we met, she did not. We did not talk about religion. And finally, her father, the minister, said, "Well, Katrina, what's Frank's religion? I assume since he's a Catholic, since he's from New Orleans, he's Italian and all, that he's probably a Catholic," which of course I was initially. But I'm my six of the six siblings, I was the only one who was a fallen away Catholic. And so she said to her dad, she said, "Oh, he's a Unitarian." He said, "Oh my God, they don't believe in anything," which was not a good way to get started with the family. But I think after a while I was forgiven that.
Well, everyone who knows Katrina knows that she is a very dynamic presence, and she's like the power behind the throne.
He is, Tom. Thank you for
Those who
saying
know
that.
Katrina also know that she doesn't suffer fools well, and she doesn't mince words.
That's right.
I think people love about her. She says exactly what's on her mind, sometimes to your consternation.
It's correct. You know me well enough to know that.
Well, but I love your love story. Talk about how you met at the Capri Lounge. Is that correct?
Yes, when it's now an Italian restaurant. It was owned by two Greek brothers, and they had a piano bar and a piano, and they would be dancing among the tables and stuff like that. So we met in that way. We both had taken ballroom dance lessons, and that's how we met. And I can remember that I'd ask her to dance, and it was a slow dance. She said, she said, "I don't dance with strangers as slow dances." And that kind of discouraged me. And I can remember leaving that place and saying, "You know what? I'm not going to pursue her anymore. I don't need to come to this smoky place and everything." And that was on a Friday night. Saturday morning, I was at IHOP, the International House of Pancakes. They have breakfast with my two sons, which we do every Saturday morning. And all of a sudden, I looked over and I saw Katrina in another booth. So after we finished breakfast and my sons left, I went over and I said, "It's a funny thing seeing you here after a thing last night." And I said, "It must have been the universe that brought us together." And she later told me that she questioned in her own mind whether I should continue to believe it was the universe or whether she should tell the truth. And she told the truth. Like you said before, Tom, whether the truth hurts you or not, she tells the truth. She said, actually,
anyone who knows her knows how direct she is. She gets right to the point.
Right. And she said that a friend of hers told her that that I go to IHOP every Saturday morning. She said, this is my third Saturday here, and you finally noticed me.
Oh my.
And
Oh.
she had been stalking me, and I didn't even know it.
That's a great story. So let's shift to your career. Okay, so what happened? You were at Conoco for how long?
For 2 years, too many, for 2 years,
Okay, and then you went on to where?
to the Ford Motor Company.
Oh, that's right. That's right. You said that earlier. Okay, well,
Yes.
tell me about what happened to the Ford Motor Company.
And I absolutely loved it. It was really dealing with people. It was in a sales position. And I started in Houston. They transferred me to Detroit. And I was in the marketing department at Detroit. Loved it there. They transferred me to Indianapolis.
That's
I was
how
here,
you ended up here. What year was that?
and that was in 71.
Okay.
And so they transferred me here. Then 2 or 3 years later, they wanted to give me a promotion. And with Ford, like a lot of major companies, you need to move in order to be promoted. You need to be ready to move. They wanted to move me to Los Angeles. And it just so happened that at that time I was undergoing a divorce and I had two young sons living here. And there was no way that I could move to Los Angeles and be 2,000 miles away trying to raise them. Even though Ford said, oh, we'll fly you home every other weekend. And so you can't do that. So it broke my heart, but I had to leave Ford. And I didn't have a job. And I can remember my soon-to-be ex-wife said, well, how are you going to support, the kids and everything? And I said, look, I'll find a job. So had moved out of my house into an apartment project. And I noticed that the apartments were not really well managed. So one day I went to the manager and I asked her about her career and her job. And I said, who do you report to? She said, some guy out of Columbus, Ohio comes in once a month and he inspects the project, tells me what needs to be done. And I said, does he also train you? She said, oh, I really don't need any training. And right then I thought to myself, you know what? Here's a multi-million-dollar property being managed by somebody who's really not well trained to manage it. So I decided to go to some other apartment projects and pretend I was a shopper, pretending I was interested in moving in. And I found out that none of them really did a good job. And I was thinking to myself, maybe this is something I could go into. I wasn't in the car business, but there's no other major car company here unless I went to a dealership. So I had to find a new career. So I looked up, there wasn't an internet in those days. So I went to the business library and found out that a guy named Gene Glick owned the most apartments in Indianapolis. So I wrote a letter to him. And I said, dear Mr. Glick, I have no experience in property management. You lead with your weakness. And then he'll wonder, well, why is he writing if he has no experience? And I said, but I have some transferable skills. And the letter hit his desk. And it so happened that 2 days before my letter hit his desk, he met with his executive vice president, and they decided that the company had grown too large for him to continue managing the projects on it. They had 11,000 units personally because he was too involved in construction, and that's where the money was at the time. So they needed somebody to run the management company, and they had no one they felt was qualified to be promoted from within. So when my letter hit his desk, he wrote across the top of the letter, Max, this is the human being you and I described the other night. And that's how I went to work for the Glick Company.
Wow, talk about being in the right place at the right time. But your whole life, though, this is one more example of the pattern of how you create opportunities and you also seize them when they come your way. Would you say that's right?
That's true. Generally, when I seize them, it's a result of a setback. Like, for example,
yes.
For example, when I loved Ford, but I was forced to leave.
Gotcha.
Yep. And so that made me do this, just like in school.
Sure.
In order to overcome the lack of speaking ability, I went with in a debating team.
Yeah.
And so on. So it's always a setback, and that's when that's really how a lot of my motivational speaking started, because I realized from my own personal experience that we may screw up, we may make mistakes, but we can convert that into an opportunity if we work at it, if we persevere, if we set an alternative goal.
Well, it's classic turning, lemons into lemonade.
Yes. That's
And
the old Dale Carnegie thing.
what people respect you for is like you have demonstrated a character over your lifetime, and that's one of the reasons you're so respected. And I would say that you definitely used the adversity. It helped you develop the character you have.
I think that's true. I remember in college, one more example, I was in a fraternity and I was really interested in working at the fraternity and doing things to help my other brothers. And I would like to had a goal of becoming president of it. But meanwhile, I ran for treasurer. And I was against someone, and I was in business school, and he was in engineering. So I thought it was a shoe-in for it. Well, we left for voluntary remarks. When we came back out, I found out I had lost. And I found out while I was gone, someone had revealed that I was not paying my dues. But what they didn't say was I signed an agreement that I would pay it over time. But meanwhile, I lost the election. So I started brooding. And I decided that, I need to get over this. And again, the way to get over it would be to set an alternate goal. So instead of my goal being become president of the fraternity, I decided I wanted to be student body president. And immediately, when I reset my focus, my attitude improved. And I loved the alternative. And again, it's encountering a setback and figuring out how you can turn it into an opportunity, or as you said before, making lemonade out of lemons.
One of the reasons I think that you and I have, another thing we share in common is that we've discussed this before. You've led a life that is intentional. Would you say that's true?
Yes.
That there isn't anything that you do that doesn't, that there isn't a positive outcome. That's what you're going for in terms of your life philosophy. Do you think that's true?
Yes. And in fact, that's one of the things, as I mentioned before, that started my career in motivational speaking, was that we can set a goal for what we want. And if we persevere and work hard at it and set a plan of action and follow it, that we can accomplish it.
The other thing that I've noticed that I really appreciate is your ability to reinvent yourself. I've done a bit of that myself.
Yes, I know you have, and quite effectively.
Well, thank you. So let's talk about how you got into the arts game. That's a great story too. Again, people can read these in my column, but I'd like for people just discovering you or hearing this podcast about what it is that led you to become one of Indianapolis's most prominent arts patrons, a big supporter of a number of organizations, and we'll talk about a few of those. But how'd you get started in the world of philanthropy?
Well, like everything else in my life, I had a lot of help along the way. And I mentioned Gene Glick already. Well, now I'm going to mention someone else. One day when I was working at Glick, before I was involved in any not-for-profit organization, I get a phone call from Henry Ryder, who was an attorney, and he did contract work for Glick. And he said, Frank, I'm calling you to ask you for a favor. And I said, anything, Henry. And he said, I'd like you to handle the operating fund campaign for the Art League. And I was stunned. And there was silence for a couple of seconds. And I said, Henry, what is an operating fund campaign and what's the Art League? He said, I knew you were going to say that. He said, would you drive to Broad Ripple after work today? And he gave me the address and go to the Art League, which is what the Arts Center was called at that time, and ask for a young lady named Joyce Summers. And she'll tell you about the Art League. Well, that was a turning point for me, because Joyce Summers not only told me about the Art League at the time, but I also joined the board. Again, my first board experience in a not-for-profit organization. And furthermore, she started me on to philanthropy, because she came in one day after a board meeting. She said, "Would you come to my office?" I said, "Sure." And she said that, she asked me what motivated me to join the Art League, which I thought was kind of a strange question, because, she knows how I happen to show up there. And I said, I love the outreach program. The fact that you make art available to those who otherwise could not afford.
So it harkens back to your early experience of not discovering art until much later.
Yes, absolutely. And I said, "I like the outreach." She said, "I'm really glad to hear you say that, because we're going to build a new building by Michael Graves. And one of the reasons is to enhance the outreach opportunity." And right then I realized I had given her the reason to ask me for a contribution. And she did ask me for a contribution. And it was for more than I'd ever given before, because I was still afraid of running out of money. And plus, I didn't have much not-for-profit experience, hardly any at all. So after some amount of trepidation, I said, "Okay, I'll do it." Now, then 2 weeks later, she comes in and she says, invited me to her office. And I said, "Joyce, I don't have any more money." She said, "No, I don't want to ask you for more money." She had a set of plans. And she said, "There's a new thing in the not-for-profit community, that when a donor makes a contribution, depending upon the amount, they can name something." And I said, "Like, why?" I said, "That's kind of weird." She said, "It may be weird, but that's the thing now in not-for-profit." And she said, "For your contribution, you can name 2 or 3 different things." And one was the gift shop. And because I enjoy shopping, and I always go to a gift shop after I go to a museum to take home a piece of the museum without stealing it. And so I named the gift shop. Now, 2 years later, I'm in her office and she said, "We have to make this mortgage payment on a building, and it really does hamper our operating funds." And so the bottom line was, she asked me to pay off the balance of the building. And that took a while for me to decide on that. And finally I did. And then she comes back in 2 weeks later and says, "For that amount, you can name something else like the auditorium." And because I was a speaker and I love plays, I did that. So that began my career in philanthropy, of not only donating, but when a not-for-profit asked if I wanted or what I wanted named in response to it, I would say either the gift shop or the theater. And it all started with Joyce Summers.
Let's talk about some of these organizations that you supported. And anybody who's been to the Indiana Historical Society, the Athenaeum, the District Theater, Indy Fringe, of course, the Art Center, and on, the Palladium. Your name and Katrina's name are on various buildings, various gift shops, and others. So I can't even remember all of them, but your name is synonymous with generosity. So what has been your guiding light, though? Would you say it has been the outreach? These organizations, you've been very purposeful in their missions. And would you say what they all have in common is this concept of outreach?
To an extent, yes, Tom. Another really good question. I have a personal mission which began to formulate when I was in college and being exposed to the arts and everything. And my personal mission is to assist in any way I can people, particularly those who are marginalized, either through income, through race, or sexual orientation, or whatever, that they're marginalized, to help them achieve their potential and to use their time and resources to the greatest extent possible. And I've been able to do that through not-for-profit organizations. And again, you mentioned the Phoenix Theater beginning. That was one of the first ones because of Brian Fonseca, when he asked me if I would fund something that he called the Festival of Emerging American Theater. And that's where he received submissions of plays by emerging artists, emerging playwrights. And he would select 5 or 6 for a weekend festival. And it would give these playwrights an opportunity to have their plays presented on stage. And I love that concept because it fit my mission of helping people, particularly in the arts world, because most people in the arts world are having to do something else to make a living aside from what they do in the arts community. So I did that, and I did that for 15 years until we finally decided to discontinue it. But I got a lot of satisfaction from that. And then Ellen Munns with Storytelling Arts saw that, and she said, could we do the same thing for storytellers, where we would have an annual scholarship for 2 or 3 storytellers to enable them to develop a new story. And this would help storytellers in their career development. So I said, yeah. So it became Emerging Stories. And that started in 2000, and it's still going on now, 24 years later. So these things, this philanthropy, Tom, really does help with my personal mission. And almost every contribution, I look at it from that standpoint. How does it fit with the mission? And also, I believe from the standpoint of the not-for-profit, it helps to bind the donor with the organization. Because almost immediately after, for example, at the Arts Center with the gift shop, I wanted to see the financial statement to see how we were doing and what things we had. It enabled me or encouraged me to have a greater participation in the organization because of the name. And I think that's one of the byproducts of this naming thing that Joyce talked about back in the 1980s.
One of the, you mentioned Brian Fonseca, and you and I have a shared history with Brian. As you know, I was a founding board member of the Phoenix Theater. We didn't know each other then, but I had the privilege of being in a living room with 10 other people when Brian pitched the idea that he wanted to do this theater. And, you know, you shared some pretty intimate moments with him, as I did. And, you know, you were the one who gave me the called me to inform me that Brian had passed away due to COVID. And, you know, that was one of the toughest phone calls I ever had to take. And so you and I, you know, have this shared experience with Brian, and both of us, you know, in our different ways, you through supporting him all those years, and mine through the media and various other things. You know, we got a firsthand look at Brian the person and Brian the visionary.
Absolutely. In fact, I attended plays long before I really met him close up. Because one day he came to my office at Glick, and I was delighted that here the producing director of my favorite theater should be coming to see me. And I was thinking, why is he coming here? Because, you know, I already have season tickets, so he couldn't be selling season tickets. As it turned out, he said that they were donated by Scott Keller, a church building, and they needed to raise money in order to renovate it. And he was coming in to ask if I would make a lead gift and if I would chair the capital campaign to raise the money. And so that was my first up close contact with him. And we did, and I agreed to do it, and we did raise the money, and we moved into the church building, which was really a really neat facility. And of course, you've been there many times.
Sure. Do you miss Brian?
Absolutely. You know, and I feel a continuing closeness though through the Fonseca Theater.
Yes, and I was going to get to that. You know, that was your last, if you will, transaction with Brian, was it not?
Yes, because after he left the Phoenix Theater, he and I met several weeks in a row at the Panera Bread in Glendale.
I call it your satellite office.
That's right. It's my satellite. You're right. My main office is on 82nd Street, Panera Bread, and that's a satellite office. But he and I met there and talked about the future and everything. And one day in late July, he came back from a spiritual retreat and told me he was thinking about leaving Indianapolis, which really stunned me because it would be a loss for our city and I think for him. And so I said, Brian, I don't know what you want to accomplish somewhere else, but is there something that you want to do here that you would love to do if you were able to? He said, yes, there. And without hesitation, he said, I would like to start a small theater in Hawville where I would produce plays that fulfill plays in accordance with my mission and not have to worry about raising $1 million because it would be a small theater. And I said, why Hawville? And he said, because for the last 2 years, I've had a $100,000 transformational grant from Lilly Endowment. And I did all of my work in Hawville, working with the community there, which has a high percentage of Hispanics. And he said, and I like it. And I said, I think they could use the help in a theater like this. And just to back up for a moment, he did the same thing in the Chatham Arch area when he renovated that church. And he was responsible to a great extent for increasing the
Well, so to the point that they named it the Arts District.
Yes, that's right. That's right. In any event, so he said he wanted to do the same thing. And I said, why don't you put together a plan for how you could do this and so on? And I said, take, 3 or 4 weeks. 2 days later, he called. He said, I have the plan. So we met again at Panera Bread, and he showed me the plan. And I said, when do you think you would start this? And this was late July. He said, and I was thinking it would be maybe a year or two for the first play. He said, September. I said, what? Could you do it in September?
That's so classic, Brian Fonseca.
I know. And he said, when we tore down or when we moved out of the church in Chatham Arch, we had seats and equipment that we could no longer use. So I donated those to Indy Convergence in Hawville. He said they have all of that equipment and everything. So we could launch a play using their facility until we build out our theater in Hawville, make the first production. And he said, and I have the contacts, the resources and everything, put it together. And sure enough, the first production of the Fonseca Theater was at Indy Convergence in September 2018.
And I was there reviewing.
Yes.
Well, for those listening, I have a story to share about another mutual experience that you and I had, that we shared. And you well know how it is that I moved in a home next to Brian Fonseca's in Hawville.
Yes.
And so, there's a lot of significance tied to that. When Brian decided when the theater started, Brian, it was very important to him that if he was going to serve this community, that he was going to live there. That's the kind of integrity he had.
Yes.
So I received an email. He had copied a number of his friends on an email that there's a house next door that is being rehabbed like the one I'm living in, he said. And a lot of the houses around Hawville are like over 100 years old. And so he said, there's a house next door to me. I would love for it to, someone in my circle or a friend to own it so that I could have, a neighbor that's someone that I know. And I saw that email and I quickly responded to him because at that time I had been living in Irvington for almost over 10 years. And I like the idea of Hawville because, I'm Mexican-American and yet I had never grown up in a Latino community, a barrio, if you will. In fact, my family in Fort Wayne is very isolated from other. There are very, very, very few Mexican American families. Only my own relatives who moved from Texas over a period of time. But anyway, to shorten the story, I ended up moving in the house next door to where Brian lived, and we were to be, we daydreamed about growing old together on our porches and sharing war stories. And of course, Frank, you know that eventually I invited you to my home and you were able to see where Brian lived prior to his death. And so there's a lot of significance tied around all of this,
Yes.
And I'm now living in Hallville. It's probably one of the most fulfilling experiences I've ever had. I'm surrounded by a lot of immigrants from Mexico and Central America, and I finally get a chance to use my limited Spanish. So Brian's spirit looms large in my life, and he thought the world of you and what you did for him and the Phoenix and for the community in general. So are your activities, I know that you've been retired for a while. What's your life like now?
Well, my work has been replaced by not-for-profit participation and philanthropy, other than personal things such as doing some travel, although we haven't traveled lately, and attending performing arts events and doing ballroom dancing and stuff like that. But primarily through not-for-profit. Matter of fact, most of the friends I have, like you, for example, I really met through not-for-profit participation, partially because we have similar values.
Good point.
And through philanthropy.
What is the profile in your mind of an arts patron? Just generally speaking, what do you think? What is the profile of an individual that you run into at the theater or the art gallery or a dance concert or whatever?
You know what?
What do they share in common?
They share in common that they care about other people. That's what I've found, and they're able to either through their volunteering or contributions to the organization and everything, they're able to help the organization accomplish its mission, and through that, they're able to help individuals that the organization serves. So I've really found that in common for them, and maybe that's part of the reason why I'm very comfortable being with them. And in fact, I ran across something the other day that the word philanthropy started out as a Greek word, and it was coined by a Greek philosopher in the 5th century. And the direct meaning is love of humanity. And it's kind of interesting. And I find that not everybody is philanthropic to the same extent, but by the fact that they attend these organizations, they're contributing to the organization and they are being philanthropic. And then I looked up the definition of it finally after all of these years in the dictionary, and I wrote it down. And it said gifts of time, talent, and treasure to help make life better for other people. And I think that defines people who are truly interested in the arts, that they care about other people and they would like to help to make their lives better.
I've always wanted to ask you this question, and I have the opportunity now. So what's it like when you come upon your name emblazoned on a building? What goes on inside you, or are you just sort of commonplace to you now?
You know what? I always reflect upon why that's there and how it happened, no matter where it happens to be. If it's the Historical Society, I think of John Herbst and in our discussions about, for example, building a theater to serve smaller performing arts groups who could not afford or did not need a larger theater and so on. So I think in terms of, when I see that, I think in terms of why that was done, the history of it, and it gives me a great deal of satisfaction. As I said before, I think when our name is on something, it helps to give us even a greater identification with it. And it reminds me of things that are important to me. It reminds me that that helped to fulfill my personal mission that I mentioned earlier.
I also mentioned another shared experience we have, with our with your support of what Dustin and I do. Remember when we invited you to Dustin's home? He
Yes.
doesn't cook. He never entertains. I'm the entertainer in the company. And I cooked up some, I think it was lasagna.
Yeah.
And the evening consisted of Dustin and me. I think we fed you guys, and then we invited you into Dustin's living room where he has the grand piano. And by the way, where we've done many of our auditions and rehearsals, and it's easy because his grand piano is there. Dustin, for those who don't know, teaches at Carmel Clay Elementary, and he's a theater and choir director. But anyway, we sat down and we played you selections from the score, and you got a big kick out of the fact that I sang with Dustin. He's a singer professional, but I don't think you realized at the time that I, in fact, have a musical theater background, and I sang in the men's chorus. So, but you didn't know I could sing.
No, I did not.
But anyway, that was the course of the evening. And then later on, you sent a check, and you were one of our, shall we say, early investors and Call to the Musical that went on to be a big success. And hopefully that's going to be revived in the next couple of years. And so you and Katrina were early supporters. And then you went on when we started Magic Thread Cabaret to sponsor another of those projects. And you've also, I want to be transparent about this because our connection goes beyond friendship. You've helped me with my artistic vision like you did with Brian. And of course, Dustin and I both are deeply, deeply, will always be grateful to the two of you. But so and you've also been a supporter of my brand, On the Aisle, my column, and now my podcast. By being on my podcast and trusting me enough to share your story, it's just one more indication of the depth of affection I have for you. I don't want to take up too much of your valuable time, but I really appreciate your being on the podcast and sharing your story.
Tom, I have to tell you, I really appreciate your inviting me to do so, and I have loved it. You have asked questions that I don't remember anybody really asking before, beginning with my growing up, and so on and so forth.
Well, Frank, I
thought
it was time that someone humanized you, right?
Yes. Well, I appreciate that, and it enabled me to reflect on a lot of this.
Oh no, that's why people love you, Frank Basile, because you wear your heart on your sleeve, and people can see your humanity. It's not just your name on buildings. Anyone who knows you knows that that you're just a really decent human being.
Well, like I said before, most of the friends like you that I've met through the arts. And that pretty well, again, defines a lot of the people involved in the arts, is that they have good hearts and they help other people.
Well, it's a cliche question, but I got to ask it anyway, just because it's important. How do you want to be remembered?
Well, as somebody who did the best he could to help those people who needed help, I think that would be it. That's
been
my defining personal mission for years. And I originally started doing that through my motivational speaking and workshops and books and articles and so on. And lately, through not-for-profit organizations and philanthropy. And I am so grateful for not-for-profit organizations and their leadership to have missions that are so important to humanity. And without those, I don't know where we would be. And that's why I do the best I can to support those not-for-profits that reflect my own personal values, because it's the best way to accomplish it. We can't do it individually with individual people, but we can do it through not-for-profit. So I encourage people who are listening to this podcast to contribute to the not-for-profit organization that reflects their values. And Tom, I appreciate your bringing this to people's attention and everything that you do through the podcast, through the TV, through the articles, and so on, to help to publicize the missions of these organizations and to give the individual artists a boost which they deserve and should have. Thank you for doing that.
I want to leave our audience with one story that just occurred to me that you told me. It sums up who you are. You talked about being in your satellite office, Panera Bread. Give them a plug. 86th Street. Is it 86th Street? Right. And how you were observing a young man who you knew was an actor, who you had seen on stage. And as you told the story, you watched this young man storing or stocking bagels.
You got a great memory.
You knew that, it all became clear to you that, like many artists, in order to, to make a living, they have to do day jobs. And sometimes these jobs they're just a way to pay the rent and put food on the table, get gas. But this experience for you reduced it down to one of the reasons that you give. There's the big picture of the arts, but then there are these artists, like this young man who you had seen and admired, who was talented, and wishing that he could make a living at it rather than stocking bagels. Not that there's anything wrong, with those kinds of jobs or those kinds of activities, but that really rung a chord for me about how that inspired you. It just brought it all home when it boils down to that. Do you remember that experience?
I absolutely do. And you know what? And it's wonderful, Tom, that you remembered that and that you're repeating it here, because that was very significant for me. Watching him with those bagels.
I had a similar experience when we did a cabaret show. One of our performers wrote a Facebook post after she received a stipend from us, a check in the mail. And she talked about how she used that check to put food in the refrigerator. And it's just like my mind again, similar to yours, it brought it all home that, it's not a luxury. The arts aren't a luxury. And they certainly, for the people who create it, they deserve support. It's a job. So with that, absolutely. Thank you again. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of the day.
You too, Tom. And again, thank you. Take care.
Who will take center stage on the podcast next? Your seat on the aisle with Tom Alvarez awaits. Follow Tom on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok, and make sure to visit tomalvarez.studio. Watch Tom every other Thursday on Lifestyle Live on Wish TV, and make sure to listen every week here on the All Indiana Podcast Network.